So welcome to the SecureDynamics TechCast. With me, I have two past guests. I have Lester Godsey, who is the CISO at Maricopa County. Welcome, Lester.
Thank you.
And I have Krishna Narayanaswamy, also past guest, who is the CTO and co-founder at Netskope. Welcome, Krishna.
Thanks, Ashwin.
So let's talk about something that obviously is in front page all the time, which is cloud. But I wanted to kind of put cloud in perspective as it relates to what has transpired from a security and availability perspective as it relates to COVID. And obviously, we're a year from when the whole thing started. But the question is, Lester, to you, which is when COVID first hit, and again, I'm kind of using you as a proxy for your broader CISO community as well, right? The first thing that came to people's mind is, okay, everybody's kind of remote literally overnight. Productivity, efficiency, business obviously took priority, right? Now we are a year into that. What have you seen in terms of what a CISO's role is looking at right now when probably security wasn't top of mind as COVID hit, efficiency was, but now the ramifications of decisions that were made, number one, but number two, from a cloud perspective, what are some of the learnings in terms of myths and realities that have emerged?
Yeah, great question. So let me try to answer the first part. I think in terms of from a security's role, in terms of if it wasn't first in the forefront of people's thoughts, what impact has COVID had on that? I would say it certainly has helped. I shouldn't say help. That's kind of putting a positive spin on COVID, but you understand it's brought a greater awareness of the cybersecurity risks for sure. So no doubt about that. But interestingly enough, from my perspective, I think the other aspect of that has been, it depends on how you function as a CISO and your information security program within your organization, meaning if you were trying to take a more business-centric approach on what the nature of cybersecurity services were or are for your organization and how they support the mission and vision of the organization, then I think you were better equipped to help guide the organization through that period of time. And what I mean by that is, so in Maricopa County's case, our first reaction when we were all working from home was having a realistic, risk-based conversation around, hey, we need to bolster these services like VPN services, et cetera, et cetera. What can we do, even though it might impact our risk profile, to make people efficient and to be able to deliver public services, right? And so I had a very earnest conversation along those lines, very open-minded, keeping the business needs in mind. My job was just to remind and to continue to remind the organization, hey, we did this as a temporary stopgap, but here's the risk profile. Here's the risk if we continue to do this. And so the organization has been really responsive along those lines. But I think they've really appreciated the fact that I didn't raise the red flag of information security. You can't do that. Mm-hmm. You keep the bigger picture in mind, right? But on the flip side, obviously, we've seen exponential increase in the number of fish that are COVID related. We're seeing an increase on phishing, social media campaigns with regards to vaccination programs, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one thing. And then the other things in terms of just high level lessons learned or from a strategic perspective is all organizations, including government, and I would say government maybe is a little bit slower to adopt cloud services, and I'd love to hear what Krishna has to say about that, given his perspective. But government maybe has been a little slower than other sectors to adopt cloud services. But from my perspective, this wasn't a brand new aha moment. It was just more pushing the gas pedal faster, if that makes sense. So in our case, we had a strategic plan in place. We identified when we were going to adopt certain cloud security controls, but it wasn't this fiscal year, I could tell you that, given our program strategy. And we had to change that as a result of that. So we did shift priorities to acknowledge the adoption of cloud services, but then also increase demand and interest to expose traditionally internally hosted applications and expose them to the public internet. So how do we protect those, especially if they weren't designed with that in mind? So those are some of the things that we've experienced over the last year period.
So Krishna, before you answer the question, I just want to ask you what Lester mentioned is something I've heard consistently with multiple CISOs, which is timelines dramatically shrunk, right?
Mhm.
So you're in a pole position right now where, like, hey, we were going to the cloud in 2 years. No, we're in cloud today. And how does that transform the way you look at your customers and their needs?
Yeah, so again, I fully agree with what Lester said. So initially, it was all about keep the lights on, let's not impact things, right? But I think soon it came, there were two things, right? One was users are accessing applications that are sitting inside the private data centers of organizations like Lester's, right? And of course, there were various points in the journey of moving to the cloud. These enterprises were moving to the cloud. Definitely, COVID has accelerated that. Now, initially, when it started, it was all about like, let's keep the users protective. So many of the customers that we came across did split tunneling and said, hey, if you're going to the cloud, go direct, and only for my internal applications use the existing VPN. Even that was starting to tax the infrastructure that they had in place. And that's when over the course of the year, I saw it happening that more and more customers started talking about, hey, how do I move my security stack to the cloud, right? It was not initially about moving that, but I would say as the year went on and even now, it's like, yes, I allowed split tunneling, but I cannot afford to do that, especially given all the types of attacks, the phishing attacks and other things that Lester talked about, right? And so how do I move to the cloud? And when I do that, and back to Lester's point, right? Can I also do it in such a way that I don't have to expose my internal applications externally? So moving my VPN to the cloud with a zero trust approach, where I don't have to invest more into my on-prem infrastructure for VPN, but use the cloud to absorb that. So that's kind of what we have been observing.
So expanding that conversation, which is, again, you can't have a conversation without SolarWinds, right? It's in the news literally every day, whether you like it or not. But everything else that has transpired since then, that's Mimecast, Excellion, Verkada, I mean, the list goes on and on and on. But the point is, I mean, Lester, again, you and your fellow CISOs, is the talk about multi-cloud. I know clearly it doesn't make sense for a lot of smaller organizations, but larger organizations is there a risk question that's being asked if you're all in Azure, and what happens then versus trying to actually invest and de-risk by going multi-cloud?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And, for sake of transparency, at least with Maricopa County, we just completed a first phase of what I would consider our journey to cloud from a mature, methodical perspective. And so the short answer to your question is yes, absolutely. It's really interesting in that, similar to the conversation around risk, there's this false equivalency where consumers are like, well, if I just move all my services or applications to the risk or to the cloud, there's no risk for me, right? I've heard many organizations say that about PCI, and I just shake my head. And so the reason why I bring that up is one of the things we discovered is also the vendor supply chain. And so you were talking about Accellion, for example. And so that's a great example, whether you consume their services directly or use a cloud service that uses that service, down the supply chain. And so I think organizations who are not looking at a multi-cloud environment in that context are doing themselves a disservice, because just because you go in Azure, for example, and you're all in there, doesn't mean that you're not going to run into problems, doesn't mean that you're going to have a greater availability, uptime, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of factors involved in there. And also, I'm a big proponent of you pick the best tool for the job, sort of thing. So I think for those reasons, it behooves organizations at least to have those as offerings and do your research with respect to that. I know for a fact Maricopa County is looking at all the major cloud vendors. We're taking an iterative approach, of course, but we are looking at all the major cloud vendors along those lines.
So Krishna, have you also seen a shift, or at least in mindset, may not, I mean, maybe the implementation lags, but at least the realization that we can't all be in one cloud, or people are saying, hey, efficiency matters and let's trust one and go for it?
What we have seen is, I mean, not specifically driven by these kinds of attacks that we have seen in the past, but general what I've seen is most organizations at least have presence in 2 clouds, maybe not all the 3 public clouds, right? And some of it seems to be driven by the type of workloads and what type of applications they're moving and so on. Some applications are very, very like optimized to run in Azure because it uses Microsoft's ecosystem of services, right? And so for them to make a big change to try and port it to some other cloud is not really worth it. But then there are other groups, even within the same organization, have workloads that make more sense, like running in AWS, for example, right? So it's a combination of all the 3 that we have seen from a public cloud perspective. But from a SaaS perspective, it's usually, from a productivity point of view, it's either O365 or Google, right? They are the 2 major ones from a productivity point of view. And very rarely we see like those kinds of applications where organization has both of them. There are some large ones because of acquisitions and others that they have it, but yeah, that's been our experience.
Okay, so one last question. Again, let's stick with you, Krishna, for a minute, which is, given the supply chain that Lester just alluded to, right? As a vendor, are you also being asked by your customers to verify your supply chain and attest to that? And how has that changed? How has that landscape changed?
Yeah, so definitely, I mean, this has raised awareness in the market, and so when customers are making buying decisions, they want to know like what kind of vetting process we go through in identifying vendors and making sure that we are protected. Also, what kind of vulnerability scanning and other tools that we deploy to ensure that our cloud is operating, and also what are the touch points between our non-cloud assets to our cloud assets. So there's definitely the emphasis of looking into that supply chain has increased in the past few months, and so yeah, I can attest to that.
So Lester, the same question to you as a buyer, and whether it's defense in depth, best of breed. I mean, there's been all kinds of connotations about, hey, you need to pick the right tool for the job, versus having the bandwidth and the technical expertise and really the process to continually question your zillion vendors out there. So how has the mindset changed, if at all?
Yeah, so it definitely is. It's risen in our overall program prioritization, if you will. So we're tackling it multiple fold. So I'm actively working with our Office of Procurement Services, for example, to update our terms and conditions when it comes to procurement. We're updating that language to delineate between your traditional on-prem services versus cloud services. We're freshening up the language with regards to a variety of different topics, your typical SOC 2 reporting, which is kind of a no-brainer. But then we're also looking at, it's not really directly related to the question, but we're even looking at not only data ownership, which is pretty straightforward, but also data utilization, where vendors are, whether it's anonymized or not, vendors are using customer data to enhance their product. So how do we feel as a customer about that? So that's definitely high on our list. We're also tackling that not only from a procurement perspective, but kind of going back to the basics around IT asset management and extending that concept of an ITAM, let's say in conjunction with the CMDB, but then extending that to be more comprehensive with regards to your cloud services, right? And so that's really where we're going. And again, and I'm not saying this because Krishna is on the call, but this is one of the reasons why Maricopa County is very focused on implementing CASB and SASE related technologies, because we have a greater adoption of cloud services. We don't have the same insight into said services, and that's obviously a critical component. Going back to the original question around, like risk and things of that sort, how can you measure risk if you don't know what your presence and footprint is in the cloud and what's occurring there, right? So all those things coupled together. And then lastly, from a vendor supply chain perspective, this is not a new concept, even from a cloud perspective. The example I like to use is back in 2016 with that big Dyn DDoS attack, if you will. So Dyn is the company who provided DNS resolution services. And I'm not picking on them because I think their response to the attack was fantastic. But you quickly found out what major players use Dyn to do DNS resolution services, right? And that brought down a good portion of the United States, for a better part of a day. So we're just going to see more of that.
Got it. Again, great conversation. Thanks for your time, Lester. Thanks for your time, Krishna.
Sure. You're welcome.
Great.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.